Hey, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1442. So let's sum up where we're at. After explaining at length, relatively at length, the concept of Yichud Kutchebricha V'Shchinta, which began at the bottom or top of page 1436. Go back a bit, 1434 and 1435, where he's talking about Neshamas Yisrael and their Avodah, our work, and namely, what he's been talking about was Hamayruch Be'echad, Shema. When we say Shema, and we elaborate on the Echad, on the contemplation and on the emotional experience of experiencing the divine unity, that even on the lowest levels in existence, we elevate existence step by step all the way to unite the fragmented universe in which we live with a divine unity echad. That's what neshamas do. We do that with the assistance and the help of malachim. That's why we say birchus yetzer of the malachim work, because they help both elevate our avodah and also draw down the amshach and process it and integrate it like the digestive system of the gut. And yet malachim are lower than the neshamas, because the malachim, like he said, they say ayem became kveda. Where is God's covet? And the idn, neshamas rather, are kadeshim tiyu. They themselves are kaddish. This was all pages 1434, 1435. Okay, which itself, I'll just explain where the context of that followed the long discussion about neshamas themselves, because we're talking about neshamas as being oir, ner Hashem nishmasam, like oir, but the neshamas need our help when the neshama comes down below, though it's rooted in the highest levels of the Helam Atzmi, Shmaya Atzmi, but when the neshama comes down below, it goes through many layers and concealment, so it needs the support of Torah, like the eye, the vision of the eye, even though in its root, it's really unlimited, doesn't need any support, any help, but the vision of the eye in the eyeball, in the physical eye, needs an outside light as a siyua, and that light is Torah, the light of the Ayn Oid, the eyes of the people, which is the Sanhedrin, the leaders, and Einayim, the Malachim. So, and that's the context of how he's explaining, why he's explaining all these ideas, to understand, ultimately go back to the idea of neshamas and light, which goes back to the beginning of this whole section, that there's two ways that we experience the interface between the divine and existence, from the bottom up through tefillah, from the top down through Torah. Torah is Torah Oid. Now we're going to come back to these ideas and as we continue learning, but I'm just putting it into that context. But as I pointed out a number of times, at the end of the day, both Mamayla Matamayla overlap with each other. As we see, when we talk about Shema, that's davening. Davening is Mamata Lamayla. We learned that was the 550 pages before we got to page 1350. 1350 is where he moved over from, let me make sure I got the right page, yeah. We moved over from Tefillah to Torah on page 1350. But in the process of understanding Torah, remember we also learn in Torah, Torah also goes through levels. There's Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud, Torah as it comes down through our efforts, and Torah Shebal Peh, the scholars and sages who struggle through their effort to understand the Mishnah and understand the written Torah. So you also find the concept of Tefillah also has elements of Mamayla Lamat Amamat Lamayla, like we just learned before about Krishma, that Krishma also has Halah and Amshacha. Krishma on one hand is Kriya Shema, it's Halah, but it's also Kriya and Amshacha that we're drawing down. We'll get back to that shortly. So point being is that even though it's talking about Tefillah, it's still in the context of Torah, of Mamayla Lamata, which here he gave the example of Eir HaRiyah. So Riyah is an example both in Torah. Remember the three levels in Torah he talked about. Mikra, Mishnah, Talmud was the difference between Eira Makabel moonlight, the luminous stone, and the vision and eyesight. But then he moved further in the eyesight when he started speaking about neshamas, that neshamas are babas einai or ishin einai. They are the pupil of the eye, because they're rooted all the way in the highest level. And yet the neshamas come down below because they have to transform this world. And as such, they go through all the gradations, and that's why I need the support, the siyua, as he put it, of the malachim is what we're talking about now. But earlier he spoke about Torah and the Einei Eda. So it needs that support. And so in that context, we go now back to the bottom of page 1435, since he's talking about Shema, how Shema, the Echad, is our avoid of reaching upward to the highest levels. Like he said before about Amin Yesh Meirabah B'chol Keiche. When we say Amin Yesh Meirabah with all our might, means we reach to the highest levels all the way to the Helama Atzmi. But then we have to draw it down. So he speaks about Krishma, that Krishma, go back to Krishma, Krishma also has, in addition to Echad, has 248 letters. And that's the context of what begins at the bottom of 1435 to understand what are these 248 letters, which correspond to the 248 limbs of the Malka, of the divine king, Evarim the Malka, which is of Zah, and they're very, like Evarim are not an external garment, a detachable garment. They're actually part of the very person. So the same thing here, the Evarim the Malka means that we're touching so-called the very essence of the divine. And I explained how you can call it Evarim. Obviously, it's only metaphorical. It means, however, that you are that he explains the mitzvahs, the 248 mitzvahs, also 248, are essentially manifestations of the divine limbs. And with that, he started explaining Yichud, Kudsha Bricha, V'Shkinta, which is also Yichud, the Yichud of two divine levels, transcendence and immanence. Kudsha Bricha being Kadosh Umuvdal Kudsha, Kadosh, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is removed beyond, and Shkinta is the way God divine manifests, Shchenes Umislabeshes. And that, on page 1436, all the way through 1441, he explained it I counted 11 different levels, where he explained Kudsha Bricha and Shechina. The first and obvious is Zah and Malchus and Atzilus. The next was Chachma and Bina. The next was Keser and Chachma. And in Keser itself, in Arich, the two levels, Malchus of Arich or Malchus of Keser, and the Midas Atzmim of Arich, then Atik and Arich, then Malchus of Ak and Etzem of Ak, then Ak, Chitzenius Ak, and Primius Ak, which is the Kav that manifests within Ak, the Reshis Akav, the Atik, that becomes like the Atik above the Galgalta, the skull of Ak. And then the next was Kav, that the Kav itself is Shechina, because it represents the divine presence within existence. And what would be Kudsha Bricha there would be the Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. But then finally, he went all the way in Lifnei Tzimtzum itself, also Kudsha Bricha and Shechina. Also two levels, Etzem Ha'er and Ispashtus Ha'er, and then Shmaya Atzmi, which is even higher than Etzem Ha'er, higher than Er and Gili altogether. The Shmaya is it's encompassed in Atzmus itself, Kudsha Bricha, and then any form of Er would be Shchinta. Doesn't say that explicitly, but it's pretty implicit. And with that, after he finished all these levels, on page 1441, the Rebbe Rashab said, so now let us now return. Now that we know this, now we understand that this is Ramach Pikud, and these are the 248 mitzvahs that are the 248 Evarim de Malka, because mitzvahs will reach all the way to Kudsha Bricha ad Reim HaMailas, using the language of the Alter Rebbe, that Kudsha Bricha all the way to the highest levels of Kudsha Bricha. So every time you do a mitzvah, he gives the example of tefillin, you're mamshich from Meichin of Zah, tefillin shel Rosh, so for Zah, but all the way, not just Zah, Keser, the second interpretation in a Kudsha Bricha Maniach tefillin, all the way to the highest levels of Kudsha Bricha, Lifnei Tzimtzum. That's higher than Oir. He said, "V'schatmes mitzvei sai." There's mitzvahs havaya That's in Zoh, and there's Mitzvah Sai, which is from the Etzem. That's the 248 mitzvahs. And they're like they Varam the Malka. Varam the Malka is very much part of the Etzem. So he said, so the word Evarim here is coming to indicate that you're actually touching the very essence, not just the expression of the divine. And now, then the next section, which leading to where we're up to, V'hine Yadua, the paragraph on page 1441, that Krishma is klolos kol mitzvahs. Like he brings the proof from Veschanon, because it says, Zeis ha-mitzvah, this is the mitzvah that you should do. The mitzvah, what's the mitzvah? And he follows only with Krishma, teaching us that Krishma is a all-encompassing of all mitzvahs, and that's why there are 248 letters in Krishma to correspond to all the mitzvahs, which are 248 mitzvahs, positive mitzvahs. That through the halah of Krishma, you make the hamshacha of these. Let me rephrase. Mitzvahs create the yichud kutshe bricha v'shchinta, and how do we achieve that? That yichud through Shema, and that Shema is the concept of echad. The Allah, the Krishma, b'chinas atzmos ein sof, kol karenu a love v'leila midei, reaching straight a love, not to his attributes, which is already an expression of the divine, but to his very essence. That's Shema. Shemen Esrei is the next level where you integrate that, and it is the midei sof. That's where he brought that the kavanos and Shemen Esrei are about bringing the eris into the kelim. After you touch that etzem, now you want to draw it down into the structure, and that's why the different brachas in Shemen Esrei have a kavana, all with the shemis lechavim b'shem avaya. Nikud patach is in chachma, nikud tzere is in bina. That is had big b'midei sof. That's drawing it down in the divine attributes. But Shema is a love v'leila midei sof, a love, and that's ma'irich be'echad. As we learned earlier, what's the ma'irich be'echad? We take our existence, the way God speaks, dibur, dvar Hashem shamayim nasu, God speaking in specific words and created existence. We don't just connect existence with God's energy that created existence, but we elevate that energy all the way up to the thought of God, to the faculties of God, all the way to the evarim. Not just the lavush. Dibur is a lavush, is a garment. Machshav is a garment. But we connect it all the way to the very faculties of the divine, the attributes, and from the attributes all the way to the etzem, to the very etzem of the divine adrei ma'amailas, like we learned. That's yichud kutshe bricha v'shchinta, which is the same idea as hamayirich be'echad, all the way to the highest levels. Then came the next piece. That would explain Krishma ayidei halo b'chinas hayichud, the Krishma, and through that you're mamshich all the mitzvahs, because Shema is the klolos kol mitzvahs, it encompasses all the mitzvahs. So then the mitzvahs, so Shema is elevating all the way to the highest levels, like hamayirich be'echad, and the mitzvahs draw down into the yichud of kutshe bricha with shechina. But then he says, furthermore, more than that, Begam, at the bottom of page 1441, that also Shema has halah of hamshacha within it. It's not just Shema, and the Shema is aliyah, and mitzvahs is the hamshacha, but Shema itself has halah of hamshacha. So on top of page 1442, he said, because Krishma has both yichudim, milmata l'mayla and milmayla l'mata. Hamayir be'echad is milmata l'mayla, where you're saying echad and you're uniting ches and the daled existence, the seven heavens and earth, and the four different directions, ches and daled with aleph. That's milmata. And milmayla l'mata is when it says kadam lichte l'mayla l'mata l'dal ruchas elam. There you're essentially crowning God as king over heaven and earth. You're doing it from the top down, similar to what we discussed. You could take Elekai HaMelech, the divine within existence, immanent energy, and elevate it to Aremimcha, to a state of exaltedness or transcendence. Or Aremimcha Elekai HaMelech, you're drawing down that state of exaltedness into Elekai HaMelech, and that's Amlichte L'mayla L'mata. That is bringing down that divine unity downward, from the highest level down. And Shema includes both elements. Then the next piece, which we began learning, but I'm going to review it now a little more in detail. It seems to me that the next piece can either refer, I think it's referring to both forms of Yechudim, both from the bottom up and the top down, but I'm not positive because we're in the middle of it. I want to see how he's going to conclude. So for now, let's leave that open. Not sure whether he's talking about both a Yichud Mamayla Mata and Mamat Lamayla in the next section, where he brings from Mika Moicha Tafresh Kaftes, or he's talking specifically Mamayla Mata. As I said, my initial assumption is both. He's talking about the whole picture, but let's see how he spells it out. So we'll get to that. So now he goes to explain more of the contemplation. What indeed does this unity consist of? Existence is existence. You and I are independent entities. And it's true, we're all created by God, and it's true that we're really part of godliness. But what is the contemplation of Shema, the Ma'arich Be'echa, not just contemplation, also the emotional, the emotional experience of being absorbed in this unity consists of? So he's going to elaborate now in the next 2 pages what that unity looks like. We know the general principle is Echad, Yichud Kudshe Bricha V'Shchinta. We understand that. But what does it mean in specific terms when you think about existence, when existence is a multitude of details and God is one? Unity and details don't initially seem to be compatible. Even though, yes, it's true, God created the details, but how do we arrive from going from the bottom up or top down? How do we understand and experience this unity? So I'm going to go over this a little slower because we're literally in the middle of this. So I'll begin. I'm going to read it quickly, but I'm going to begin reading now from Vahainu, the 3rd line on top of page 1442. But before I do, if anybody wants to ask anything, since I did a pretty relatively long summary of the whole section and the context, maybe there's something you want to clarify. I'm happy to answer any questions. If not, I'll read from here, page line 3. But anybody? Okay. So line 3, Vahainu. So after he says Mamayla Lamata Mamata Lamayla, says Vahainu. Actually, the Vahainu looks like, because there's a comma, looks like it's a continuation of Mamayla Lamata. The next section, Va'inyan hu, but I'll read the Vahainu. Vahainu, the kol mashenisava be'emes, hakol hu elakus. Everything that was created is in truth, everything is divine. V'lo yesh shum davar oid mibila doy yizbarach klal. And there's nothing else but God. Nothing else but except God. Biladei. Without him, there's nothing else. Nothing but him, I should say. Okay. Now, being that's a comma, that sounds like it's the Yichud Mamayla Lamata, that we understand that God is everything. But then comes a period, and then he says by Inyan hu. So again, is the Inyan going only following the last line about that there's nothing but God, or is it also referring to Mamat Lamayla, that from the bottom up we come to understand that everything's united with the highest levels of the divine unity? So we'll see where it goes, but let's continue now. Inyan hu. So here he's going to quoting a classic mimer from the Rebbe Marash, as I already explained. This is a mimer that the Rebbe Marash would repeat many times. It was called a mimer that the Rabbeim had their unique, each had their so-called exclusive, that mimer that they would repeat different times for different needs to refine the avir, it says, l'zachet ha'avir, to refine the environment. So he says like this, va'inyan hu, k'meshikosa b'drush mikamoicha Hashem b'sefer reish chavtes, in the Maim Mikamoicha, B'Hashem Tafresh Chavtes. So that's the equivalent of 1869. So there he says like this: the Mitzias Hagashmi Be'emes Hu HaKoyach Eliki Amhava Eseh. The physical existence, Mitzias Hagashmi, physical matter, is in truth only the divine energy that creates it. Shahari Kol Mash and Nisavim Murkav Madal say this. So one of the proofs, one of the ways he explains it is because everything that was created is not a poshet. Poshet means seamless. Murkav means a composite. It's a composite of ingredients. namely the Daled Yesodis, Eish, Ruach, Mayim, Ofer. So the four general elements of fire, wind or air, water, and earth. Take, for example, a piece of wood. Piece of wood is made up of all four. Everything is made up of these four elements. The question is, what's primary? And this is a given. This is what we would call in scientific language, chemical language, chemistry. You call it that everything in the world is made up of elements. Elements are made up of molecules, or in turn made up of atoms, and so on. So everything is made up of composites. The very object itself is not one of the Yesodis. It's a combination, a sum total of all. Ki'im ikrehu hakeach hamarkiv esadal Yesodis. So it's not just, here we go, fire, wind, or air, water and land, and earth, rather. There's something that joins them together to turn it into this item, this object. So who's the markiv? Who's the one that brings them together into this element, to this item? That's like if you think of baking a cake made up of different ingredients, but then you need someone to bring those ingredients together and bake the cake. So that is the markiv, that's the koyach haliki, the divine energy that brings into being and sustains this object. And what is that? That's the divine statement, the divine declaration when God says Yehi Oid, Yehi Rakia, and so on. That creates the four elements, which is the beginning of creation. First you create the elements, then you combine them in different ways, and ultimately creates different items. Like the Ramban explains in his commentary right in the beginning of Bereshis. And that's the power, that's the force that creates and brings into being all the creations that have been created. That's the divine power that creates the composite, joins them together. Basically, when you look inside the Maimer and in the Ramban, you'll see he says that a mere fact that something is made up of parts tells you there has to be another force that brings them together, because the parts can't bring themselves together. It's like a conductor of an orchestra. The orchestra can't conduct themselves. You need something to coordinate them. That's one of the proofs brought in the Ramban and the Maimer Bikamoicha in explaining that existence itself is really the power of the divine that brings together these pieces. Now, the difference between a cook, a baker, and God, of course, is the baker didn't create the ingredients. He just brings them together. In this case, God created the ingredients as well and brings them together. Okay. I think this is where we stopped, actually. Yeah, we stopped here. So why is bringing this particular proof to say that existence is divine needs explanation, because why didn't he bring, for example, Shai Yichud V'Amunah? Shai Yichud V'Amunah says it even more, seemingly more poignantly, where he says that the very existence can't exist if it doesn't have God's word constantly, perpetually creating it. That's what he says there. And if 1 second God's word would be removed, everything would go back to the way it was, which there he makes the case, therefore all of existence is really the divine energy. The Daled Yesodis seems to be focusing not so much on their creation, but on their composition. So I'm not positive why he brings Dafka this thing with the Daled Yesodis and not the very fact that existence is dependent on Dvar Hashem, which he actually said at the beginning. Which is the Maimer, like he said. So it could be that he wants to just bring more details, because it's not just that God speaks and says, let there be light, or let there be a tree or wood, even though it's not one of the Asar Mamoras, but it's an extension of them. That he's actually explaining also with more seichel, that's not just God creating it, that God is also keeping it together. It's like the Rambam brings about the Galgal, when you see the sun and the moon and the celestial bodies, you have to say there's someone that's orchestrating it all. So it could be he wants to give more explanation on how the divine is actively involved in creation all the time, essentially keeping it like the glue that keeps everything together. You know, one of the big questions in physics till this day is what makes an atom, what makes the electrons, the neutrons, and the protons bind together. There's no real answer for that. They're still trying to figure out what keeps them together, that they're so tightly bound. So it could be he's trying to bring here the proof to show how God's presence is not just to create, but also to keep everything running, so to speak, or more than just running. The mere fact that you have these you say this constantly together in that way, like H2O is water, but who keeps the hydrogen and the oxygen bound together? Why don't they just separate? And it takes a lot of effort, fission, to separate the two. You can't just take a water and take an axe or a hammer and break the hydrogen from the oxygen. It's not so simple. So clearly you see there's another power that's keeping it all together. Could be that's why he's bringing that. Anyway, but the point that all this, let's not forget the key focus here is divine unity. That is the divine within existence that we're coming to arrive at. But he's going to continue now. Any questions on this piece? Because he's going to continue to explain this, elaborate, which in a way is like he's really giving us the kavana of echad. What are we supposed to be concentrating on when we say echad? So earlier we learned amayrik be'echad, all the levels. But now he's talking about it more in context of the divine relating to existence, how we discover that unity within everything that exists. Any questions? Okay. Ubira inyan hu, and the explanation of the inyan here is this. It's interesting. Sometimes the Rebbe Rashab will say inyan hu, and sometimes he'll say ubir ha'inyan. Like on the fourth line, he said inyan hu. We brought the Tafresh Chavtes, what we just learned. Now he's saying ubir ha'inyan, which means explanation, not just the inyan of it, the explanation of the idea. It's a subtle difference, but nevertheless, I just noticed it. And then different places you find that as well. So here's the bir. The hine, because now honor oimrim, we say in davening, we say in Shabbos, in Shachris, so we say 4 expressions. He's going to use all 4 throughout the next 2 pages. That's why I'm mentioning it. Ein arech lecha be'elam haza. Right? Then we say, I think he's going to bring a little later. Ein zulasecha ve'elam haba, and then he says efes biladecha, and what's the 4th one? Efes bilta and ein deimelecha. Yeah, there we go. Ein arech lecha. Yeah. Ein zulasecha, efes bildecha, and ein deimelach. Ein deimelcha. So starting now with ein arech lecha ba'elam haza. What is that? What do these 4 expressions mean? But we'll start with this. We say ein arech lecha. Arech comes from the word proportionate, erech, commensurate. So it's ein arech lecha ba'elam haza. There's nothing comparable to you in this world. So the question is, why ba'elam haza? Why not ba'elam haba? Why dafka in elam haza? So here's how Chassidus explains it. V'hainu, that means the ba'elam haza is dafka in this world, this physical world, anu yedim she'ein arech lecha, that we come to perceive and to understand that you're infinitely distant from us, infinitely, completely apart. And we'll soon see that you don't see that quite as much in the Ruchnisdika worlds, in spiritual worlds, higher than Elam Hazeh. We've learned this already a number of times. In the beginning of Ayin Beis, pretty early on, he discussed it, and a few other times that I recall, at least once or twice more. So he says like this, how do we know it? The Kashanarayan Mitzias Yesh. Because when we look at and observe the Mitzias of a Yesh, you're not just saying a Nivra here, not just a Yesh, a substantial existence, something that has an identity. Yesh doesn't always mean ego, but it means it has its a substance of its own. You have to say that its creation. It came from something that is opposite of yesh, ayin. So let's explain what that means. Why? Because first of all, ein dover eses atzmei. Nothing can create itself. So if something exists, it means something had to put it there. Now, so then you could say maybe what put it there is a previous yesh. Like a tree supplies the seed, which will give birth to the next tree. A parent supplies the seed and the egg that will give birth to a child. So that's yesh mi yesh. But then we're going to get back to the same problem because who created the first yesh? So he continues. Yesh mi yesh. At some point, there can be yesh mi yesh. Somewhere is going to have to come what put the first yesh there, because a yesh can't create itself. You could say once it's there, it can perpetuate itself, which is also not so simple. But at least you could say, fine, it has the properties and the seed, so-called, to perpetuate its progeny. It's the next generation. So it has to be ma'ayin dafka, mashkasav mokamacha, like it says elsewhere. Let me elaborate more. Why ayin? It has to come from something that's not from its own entity. So something outside of it that's not made of those properties has to put it there. So we call ayin, not ayin means nothing. Ayin means of a different sort, completely different type of reality that puts that yesh, that made that yesh there. That's the ayin that precedes the yesh. So at the end of the day, when scientists take us back in history, all the way back to the Big Bang, and then when you ask, okay, but who put that first ball of gas there, which created the Big Bang, which in turn shaped and defined existence as we know it? Not getting now into the age of the universe, just the process. Like the famous story with Chelem, with the guy from Chelem, they never saw a automated vehicle. They only knew it was horses and cows and animals. And if you wanted to get somewhere, you rode on a horse. He comes to the big city and suddenly sees a locomotive. He sees a train. And he sees it's moving. And he's wondering, how's it moving? So he comes back to his town and he says, I can't believe it. I saw a vehicle and it was moving without a horse pulling it. So they asked him, how was it moving? So he said, I asked them, they said, so he says it was moving behind the locomotive. Behind the first car was a second car pushing it. And who was pushing the second car? A third car, and a fourth car, and a fifth car, and an eighth car. And who was pushing the last car? He says, that I don't know. So in other words, you can explain, like, those nursery school books with the earth, how is it hanging in the air? So the earth is on top of the back of a turtle that's standing on top of an elephant that's standing on top of a alligator. I don't know, a whole bunch of animals. But in other words, so you can explain how a yesh became another yesh. Or like the joke they tell about the scientist that said to God, we don't need you anymore. Everything you can do, we can do. So God said, show me. So the scientist took a clump of earth, put it on his laboratory table, and he says, I'm going to show you now how I can make this earth sprout a flower or sprout some growth, some vegetation. And God says to him with a smile, he says, why don't you use your own earth? In other words, once you have my earth, yeah, you can do that. But if you don't have the initial earth. So the point is that the yesh indicates there has to be something mysterious that's not made of the same ingredients of the yesh to create the yesh. That's what he's saying right here. Vahainu. And this means, let's read the exact words, shenisava b'bchinas haischachus, that the creation comes in a form of chidush. Yesh mi yesh is not a chidush. To take a tree and the seeds of a tree, an apple tree, create another apple tree is not a chidush. It is a chidush because something can perpetuate itself. but it's not fundamentally like creating something completely from nowhere. Because you're taking genetic material and you're making more genetic material from it. But the ayin, coming yesh, the first yesh coming from an ayin is a chiddush. Chiddush means it's something that wasn't there before. Not in any other form or shape, completely outside of that, did not exist in any form before. That's its consciousness. The kodim shenisava lo yoy mitziyusei klal, prior to it being created or being brought into being, it didn't exist at all. V'nischadish mitziyusei davar meloi davar, and then its existence was innovated or came into being, was created, was produced, a davar, something meloi davar, from no substance, substance from no substance. So it's not reshaping anything that was there, reshaping it into a different form or shape. It's not even like water that you heat becomes gas or you freeze becomes ice. That's the same substance, just in different forms. But here it's something from a completely different reality. Yesh ma'ayin, what we call yesh ex nihilo, yesh ma'ayin. And that's why Dafka Elam Haza's yesh teaches us this distance. Because if it was something that was being shaped from something that was there before, it's not Ayn Oid. An apple tree is not Ayn Oid to another apple tree. A father and mother are not Ayn Oid, infinitely distant from their children. They're older, and so on. But they're the same human beings. And they're made up of the same genetic and makeup, the DNA, and so on. But Elam Haza, v'zeu Ayn Oid, and this is Ayn Oid. She's Ayn Oid, hisavus shebederech Ayn Oid. And that's what we mean that in Elam Haza it's Ayn Oid. Because the hisavus is an Ayn Oid, it's a leap. It's a paradigm shift from one reality to another reality. The misavus, okay, let's stop for a moment. Now he's going to contrast it and say, this is dafka the yesh in Elam Haza. From Oir, we wouldn't know this. Oir, indicating on the Moir, on its source, we wouldn't know this Ayn Oid. We'd know there's a source, but to say something is infinitely distant, we know this dafka from a yesh. So I would suggest to read a little more before I stop, and I'll take questions if you have any. So let me just read the contrast. So he says that the misavas ha'oir, from the existence or the creation or the coming into bringing into being of oir, oir meaning energy or light or divine energy. Here he's talking about the oir. We wouldn't know. We wouldn't know this infinite distant aspect. Because Oir is a revelation of Atzmus. It's not Yesh mi-Yesh, but it's a revelation. Like the sunlight reveals the sun. The sun has light within it. Sunlight is an expression of that light. And not only is it an expression, but it's also me'ena etzem. It's a gilim in atzmius and me'ein, and similar to the etzem. Again, similar not to it being a source of light, but light is not like if the sun suddenly, for example, produced frogs, or the sun suddenly produced trees, that would be something quite wondrous, because the sun is producing something that's not like itself at all. That would be like Yesh and Ayin. But the sun produces light, and light is a revelation of the sun, and the light is similar to the sun. The light doesn't have other properties except that which reflects what a sun is, which is to give off light. So the luminary is the sun, and the illumination is the light. So therefore, we know, so it's Me'enev. So where do you see Einarech? Rach misavas hakelim. Now he's going to kelim, not just yesh. From kelim, not oir. When you see a keli is already a receptacle. It's an entity that's not it's not sunlight. It's not divine light. Misavas hakelim or misavas hanivroim. And from the creation of nivroim, creations, creatures, not oir. Hainu, hisavas hametzias, which means hisavas of a metzias. Oir is not a metzias in that sense. It's a mitzias that it exists, but it's not a so-called defined mitzias outside of its source, as nothing but its source. So he says, Onu Yedim, from the Savas HaKelim and the Savas HaNivrim, we know she'ein areich lecha, that there's nothing comparable to you, because there's nothing in common between the Yesh and the Creator that created the Yesh. So Oid reveals its source. The Yesh just tells you there's an infinitely distant source. We don't know what it's like because it's not us. That's what the Yesh does. It teaches us the Ein Arech. V'zeu Ein Arech lecha ba'elam hazeh dafke. And that's why we say Ein Arech lecha dafke ba'elam hazeh. Ein Arech lecha. Ba'elam haba we say Ein Deme lecha. There's nothing similar to you. But Ein Arech, infinite distance, you see from something that's completely different. It would be like the difference between this is a completely not exact example, but just a small example. If you see a teacher being able to teach students that are commensurate to him, he's a teacher, so he's more knowledgeable, more experienced, but still there's something in common between him and the students. Okay, beautiful. But if you see a teacher that can speak to little children, to 5-year-olds, and explain to them an idea, that tells you that this teacher is far more apart. That's why he's able to bring it down so low. In other words, the further you can express yourself in paradigms and idioms that are outside of your normal comfort zone, the more it demonstrates on the infinite or the distance. I say distance, I mean in a positive way. How distant and how different that teacher is. So those when you can mashpia on someone who's more or less like yourself, okay, that's beautiful. But it's more like Oir, Moir, and Oir, source of light that illuminates. But when you can do something to someone that's nothing in common with you, that means that you have something within you that's far, far apart, more Ein Arech. That's why you can bring it down to a completely different type of structure and so on. That's why it says by Shlomo HaMelech, his wisdom was such that he was able to give 3,000 examples. Exodus explains not 3,000 different examples, 3,000 levels of examples. An example for an example for an example for an example. That because it showed how brilliant he was. That's why he could bring it down that far from himself. And it's just it's not an exact example because it's not infinite there, but it's an example of what Ein Arech is seen in the more, as you see the power of light. I don't want to use light because that's the example here, but the power of a torch. You see in how far and how far it reaches. If the torch only illuminates 100 feet, it's not so powerful. If you could see it 1,000 feet away or a mile away, you know how powerful it is. So the farther it can reach, the more powerful it tells you how far it is away from us, so to speak, meaning how powerfully, infinitely distant it is from us. In this case, apart would be the right word, not distant, but apart. Ein Arech lecha. Okay, let me see here. Yeah. I'll stop here. Any questions?
It seems to me that Yesh, that Ayn Oid, the Rebbe is talking about here, is different than Yesh Mi'ayin. Isn't that correct?
Not necessarily. Why do you think it's different?
Well, you use an example. If a sun were to produce frogs trees, that's Ayn Oid, but it's still Yesh Mi'ayin Yesh. It's not from Ayin. There's a sun. There's a source that's producing the frogs, which is Ayn Oid.
Well, don't use my example. Use the example he gave here. So, the example he gave here. This idea, Yesh Ma'ayin, is essentially what he's saying. I'm not sure. Ein Arech and Yesh Ma'ayin are pretty synonymous in this context.
It would seem like the Yesh Ma'ayin is much bigger pella than Ayn Oid. It would seem like for example, if you say,
I see it exactly the same thing. I'm not sure why you're saying that.
Let me finish if I could.
Dover Malay Dover. He says to create something from Loy Dover. That's like Yesh from Ayin.
If for Gashmias from Ruchnias, from all the Stalshalis down to Malchus Shabasiya is or But then you have, you say the creation of Yesh, the four elements, for example, are from or. So, but it's Be'ein Aroch. That's Be'ein Aroch because you got Gashmius and Ruchnius, which is or in materialism. Material stuff is Be'ein Aroch, but it's not Yesh Ma'ayin because it has a source. The source is from spirituality, from or, from energy. From energy
if you translate or as ayin, then the ayin is the source, but it's an arech source. Why can't you say that?
But it's not ayin. Ayin would be from ayin b'muchlat. Nothing.
What's that? So with all respect, I don't see that necessarily that way.
I mean, before the Big Bang, before the Big Bang, there was, from scientific perspective, but I'm just using the analogy. There was nothing created at all, no existence. So then it's a huge pella from something, whether it's or whether it's kalim, or whether it's gashmius, materialism, chumrius, is coming from ayin versus when you would go down and say to Ishtalshalis and say there's certain
you're saying interesting things, but it's not what he says here. He says here that Yesh Ma'ayin indicates on Ena Reich L'cha, and that's Dafkin Elam Haza. I'm not sure why you're making this distinction here. And Ayin Beis for sure he doesn't make this distinction. To me, it's actually very synonymous. To say that Ayin is the source of Yesh, no problem. But it's a different reality. Ayin and Yesh are two different realities. That's called Ein Arech. That's what he's saying here.
That could be, okay, so that's a certain type of ayin, but not an ayin muchlat.
Okay, but you don't hear a word ayin muchlat here. It doesn't even mention ayin muchlat. For all you know, he's talking about ayin muchlat.
Okay.
Why not?
Well, because that's something coming that doesn't even have a source.
Where's the word source? I mean, is God the source of existence or not the source of existence?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so what do you mean by source? So even Ein Arech is also, you can call it a source. There's no problem with the word source. The question is the source of the same material as the thing it's sourcing, or it's not. Well, anyway, this distinction, but you asked me my opinion. Yesh Ma'ayin Ein Arech, in my opinion, is synonymous in this Ayin Beis here. If somewhere else in another mimer he makes that distinction, I'd like to see it, but not here.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
If I may add, Ashgacha Pratis, in today's Tanya, if you think into today's Tanya, this is exactly what Rabbi Jacobson is saying.
What's it say there, Naftali? I didn't read it yet.
Okay, when you read it, you're going to see.
Okay.
Yeah. So far, he said his savus is b'chinas ischatrus, yesh ma'ayin, says yes, metzias yes, behechlish savus ma'ayin, and therefore it tells us the yesh and the kalim he also included that indicate on ein arech l'cha be'elam haza. Okay. Now, just to distinguish between kalim and nivroim, let me just say this: ein arech l'cha be'elam haza. It doesn't say ein arech l'cha in the kalim of Atzilus, because Elam Haza is obviously the most prominent place where you see a yesh. And this yesh tells us that it must be coming from something completely different than existence. Kalim, you could have a concept of Kalim of Atzilus, for example, that are divine Kalim. So why does he bring Kalim? Because he's comparing Kalim to Oir. When you look at Oir, there's no issue at all. Oir doesn't have anything but a reflection of its source. Sunlight is telling us the sun. Moonlight is the moon. Candlelight is a candle. A keli, on the other hand, because it doesn't look like the sun, means that it has to come from a force that's nothing in common. Sunlight, the light comes from the sun. Kalim, you have to say, comes from something that's so-called beyond, because a keli is not reflecting, doesn't look similar to what created it. That's why he's bringing it here. But the truth is, Kalim and Ivraim sometimes are brought in the same phrase like here, because he wants to make this point of Ein Arech. But when you really break it down, obviously, Elam Haza, the Kalim in this world, are more Ein Arech than the Kalim, let's say, in Atzilus. But he's not making that distinction. I'm just pointing out since he brought the word kalim. So when you talk kalim, like lifnei tzimtzum, for example, the power to create oir comes from the power of Gilui and Elikus, and the power to create kalim comes from the power of Esem, of Helam, because a keli is not reflecting on the divine emanations. It's like what I mentioned before. If you see a person, let's say, an artist creating art, that's like light. But if the artist suddenly does something that you would never expect coming from an artist, tells you that he's more than just being an artist. So the fact that light comes from Hashem, if you only had Oir, you'd know that God is a luminary. You'd know that he's a Moir. And that would be it. But when suddenly you see a Keli, you say, where is this coming from? That means God must have power that's much more than just light. Other powers that are beyond just reflecting his personality. Something that's not reflecting, something that's different. That different indicates on an Ayn Oid element. That's the point he's making here with the Kalim and the Nivraim. But now he takes it further even. Let's go further. Uma'achar. And now that we know that creation of the Yesh, of course, is in the form of an infinite leap, a paradigm shift, an infinite distance, in a form of real chidush, not a continuation of what was there before. Something new has been innovated. Then you have to say another thing it compels us to say. That this power that of renewal, that renews this and that brings something new into being, has to be there constantly. The im yufsak memenu koyach hamachadish, if it would be removed even for one moment, if it would pause, yizbat legamri, that object would cease to be v'iyah ayin ve'efes, and would become completely null and void. Like he explains in Shai Yichud V'Amunah. If you take a piece of gold and you shape it into a ring, so once the craftsman, the goldsmith, has shaped it into a ring, you don't need the goldsmith there all the time to keep it in shape. Why? Because it's yesh miyesh. But if you create something completely new, it doesn't have any substance of its own. It's completely coming from something that's outside of it. That outside force has to constantly be there to keep it there, because it doesn't have any of its own value. So that's the second point that Chidush teaches, that a Chidush needs a Machadish, something to keep it there. It's similar to what it says in Nigla, one of the Chidushim of the Ragat Shover. They said marriage is a Pa'ula Nimshachas. In other words, you don't just get married and then stay married. Every second needs to be renewed with a certain divine energy. Why? Because man and woman are opposites, like Kosher Kriyas Yamsuf, and just like Kriyas Yamsuf, water and land are opposites. For the water to be standing like a wall and allowing them to walk through, you need a constant power to keep the water standing, or else it would fall down, like he explains in Shai Yichud V'Amunah. So the same thing, because a man and woman are different, strangers. So as much as they care about each other and love each other, there needs to be a third power, a power outside of them that always keeps the glue, keeps them together. A famous story where he shared this idea with Reb Chaim Brisker, his colleague. And Reb Chaim said to him, so Mazel Tov. He says, why are you telling me Mazel Tov? He said, because you just got married. Based on your Chiddush, it's a constant, perpetual yichud. So the Ragat Shover said the Mazel Tov that was said at the wedding is also perpetual. However you explain it, bottom line is that you need a perpetual power when you're dealing with something that naturally would not be there. So since the Yesh is not a natural entity, it's not a natural extension from the Ayin, so you need the Ayin to constantly keep it alive, basically, to keep it going. Okay. Shari Hefresh, Bein Ayin v'Yesh v'Ila v'Ol, because the difference between creating something Ayin and Yesh, an Ayin to Yesh, and Ila v'Ol, which is cause and effect, I'm sorry, I didn't read the right song. The melody should be like this. And this is the difference between Ayin Yesh, that the Ayin needs to constantly be recreating the Yesh, and Ilivol cause and effect. As it's discussed, explained elsewhere at length. So based on all this, what do we derive from this? V'im kain. If it's so, be'es mitziyusei, once this thing exists, be'es, as it exists, ma'al mitziyusei. What exactly is its existence? Hadikol mitziyusei raka ayin eliki. Its entire existence is only the ayin eliki, the divine other state. The other state, meaning ayin, not like the yesh, the ayin eliki, hamahava esei, that brings it into being and creates it. Without that divine ayin, be'emes ein shum mitzias klal. In truth, there's no mitzias at all, because there's the ayin that's keeping it in existence. It doesn't have any value or substance of a power of its own. Which is the topic that he began. That's what he said all the way in the beginning. From Tafresh Chavtes, from Mika Moicha. So now I go back to the Daled Yesodis. So you have to say what he was trying to prove with the Daled Yesodis was not just that it's markiv, but that it's giving it very existence. It's not just that it's joining together these ingredients, because there's like this mitziyusei. I know.
Is it possible he's
okay? Could be.
Corruption.
Just one second. Let me finish my sentence. I think what he's saying is because the Daled Yesodis are the Yesh. Since they're a Yesh, like he's explaining now, they can't have created themselves. So their creation and their being brought together is the Koyach Halaki that's outside of them, the Ayin that's creating them and also joining them together. That's how I think he's explaining it. I have to look back in Mika Moicha, but I'm almost sure that's what he says there. Now I understand that. Okay, so in other words, because he said this word, he says, Shari kol mashin isav and murkav, the very existence is not one of the four elements, but the koyach hamarkiv, hainu hakoyach halaki. So in other words, the elements indicate on the yesh of it, whether it's fire, wind, water, and earth, or the combination of them. But the fact that what created that yesh, and what brings together the ingredients that define the yesh, that's the koyach halaki is talking about now, and therefore it has to be there constantly, because if it's not there, the whole thing falls apart. Not just falls apart as a composite falling apart, but the whole thing won't exist in the first place. So I think it's two steps. It's creating it and then keeping it together. Okay. What do you want to say? So you wanted to say something?
I was going to say something very similar, but in addition, it also connects the Indian of Yichud Shchita B'Kucha Brichu, because that chain essentially is showing the derivation of source and from the ayin to the yesh, and vice versa. How we can retrace the steps back to the ayin, our ultimate source, that which is vivifying ourselves. I was just
but I would distinguish, because the Shechina is not yesh. Shechina is also ayin.
Okay. But nevertheless, that I hear you. But I guess what I'm trying to say is the roots of our divine energy are coming through that chain. Meaning, I don't see how Atzmus vivifies me. But if you take the Hishtalshalus all the way down, you perhaps can relate to it better. I don't know.
I would wait with that, because right now he's explaining, what's explain Yichud. But we'll see how it's going to develop. He'll probably come back to explaining how you bring that Yichud up to the highest levels. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yes. The Rebbe said, "Behechrich," you must say that the God has to be like Shar Yichud Amuna, constantly vivifying us. But why? To me, I've always questioned why we have to say Behechrich. God can do anything, and so He could. It's not necessary for that. He could have set it up like the gold watch that we would have self-perpetuating within us, like on autopilot, so to speak, existence. He didn't do it that way, as the Rebbe clearly explains, but he could have done that way. And I would think that maybe the reason he doesn't do it that way and is always constantly with us, within us, vivifying us, is to enable us to have a constant yichud with God, and so that there's a positive benefit for that, rather than by saying it's behechrich that he had to do it that way. What would be your comment on that?
Because God also created rules of logic and wanted to, as much as possible, explain in logical ways. Yes, there's no question God could have split the water by Kriyas Yamsuf without a wind and without anything. He could have had the Jews walk right on the water, for that matter. He could have just split it without a wind. Why did he need a wind all night? Keep the water up. Because God created a world that he wants us to understand. And it makes a lot more sense that for an opposite to happen, a Yesh, that the Ayin would be there all the time. Could he have done Kol Yachol, whatever he wanted? Of course he could have. But he wanted us to understand it as much as possible, which is reason you have a whole Seder Shtalshus. He also didn't have to create Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya, or Ak, or Kav, or Kutchabricha, and Shechina, and and Kalim. Could have created existence and said, go ahead, make a Dira B'Tachtenim. But it would not be in the way the world is created with the logic that we have. We would not be able to understand it. It would all be God's power. And that would be it. So the fact is, the Yesh Ma'ayin explanation that he says Behechrich is Behechrich al pi the Klali HaSeichel that God created in existence. If you suddenly saw a stone flying, you're going to say it's not flying on its own because something is throwing it. There's some energy in it. You could always say, 1 second, maybe God's just doing a miracle. He wants a stone to fly. But it doesn't work that way. So, yes, of course he could have. That's the first thing. Second of all, this is a discussion that I've given many classes on. I just did in the Kollel 2 weeks ago. Whether God can pick up a stone that he himself can, if God can create a stone that he cannot lift. So the Rebbe speaks about this at length in the later years, that God could have created the world any way he wanted. He could have created a world with perpetual power without having to renew. He could have created the world without a tzimtzum altogether. Could have created the world with tzimtzum kipshute. But the fact is he chose not to. And once he chose not to, and we receive from our teachers that he chose to create in a perpetual way, so then we explain it that way. But the bottom line is, these are the two things, that's what I would say regarding the behechrich. And once it's done a certain way, that becomes the hechrich, just like we say other things are muchrich. You could also say, how do we know that we say, ein davar eses atzmi, nothing can create itself. Maybe God created something that could create itself. That's also possible. So then basically all logic falls to the side because anything is possible. God created a world, then he decided to disappear, and now the world doesn't have a God. Most people, we wouldn't usually say that, right? Because we'd say that too is part of what God wants. But bottom line is that's more or less the answer I would give.
What was the topic in the Kollel? What was the topic in the Kollel? So maybe I can look at the class this year.
The title was called "Can God Create a Stone That He Himself Cannot Pick Up or Lift?"
Okay,
that's the title. Those words.
Is it worth posting to the Ayin Beis thread, or just people can look for themselves?
No, you can post it. It touches on this topic. It's not so much Ayin Beis, but you can post it. Sure, please.
Okay.
I'm just saying that I realized, sort of like from today's class, that in addition to the logical and relationship, the seichel different relationship that we can have by doing it that way, steps and so on, that we can relate logically, by having a God having constantly a Maisa Bereshis Tamid, that it enables us to have a more profound, deeper, intimate, constant relationship with God. It's not a logical.
I don't know if you came up with that idea yourself, but the Rebbe says in the Sikh in Tov Aleph, a Sikh that I actually prepared. He spoke for the women, and he says that in a note explaining that. So that's explicit in a Sikh actually.
Which Sikha is that? Do you remember?
I remember the date. It should be around now, Sivan time. So the women, I think in Tov Shinun Aleph it could be. Sefer HaSikh is Tov Shinun Aleph. The Rebbe says that explicitly.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, he says Yesh Shleimer. One of the reasons God did it that way was in order for us to have a constant relationship with Him.
Okay. Thank you. Wow.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Gave yesterday was a very good talk.
Oh, you heard from your wife?
It was very to the point and good.
But this you heard from your Ezer Connect Day, right?
My wife told me.
Yeah. I spoke for the graduates. Rab Shleim was talking about a talk I gave for the graduates, 12th graders. Yeah. It wasn't recorded. It was Shabbos, so. Thank you. Shkoyach, thank you. Okay.
Welcome.
Okay, so let's continue here.
It was very to the point and very powerful. So, Yashar Koyach.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome.
Right, Taital, what was the main point? If you brought it up, what was the main point?
You have a Simon himself, I have to say it.
Well, maybe say something.
It's two different simchas here. It's the Ayin Beis. It's a theme I've spoken. Some of you may have heard me speak about the Rebbe's 5 main contributions. Acronym MIPOD, M-I-P-O-D, Mission, Initiative, Persistence, Opportunities, and Destination. You ever heard me speak about that?
I don't think so. MIPOD?
I haven't either.
Maybe
really?
MIPOD.
Okay. So then, it's. I'm listening. Everything's connected, but if you don't mind, let's finish learning this. Then maybe I'll post. Well, Shabbos talk I can't post, but I think I spoke about it as well. I mean, I'm going to be in Pittsburgh on Tuesday, so I may speak there again about it. So I hope they record it. I'll post a recording. I think I have a few talks I gave on it. It was like basically Chav Ches Sivan and Gimel Tammuz. Like, how would you explain major contributions of the Rebbe to the world? You know, what the Rebbe contributes. So I phrased it in those five points. I know you're getting more intrigued as I speak. I got it. So I got to. So let me do this. Let's finish this class. I'll try to post something that I've already done on this topic. Okay. So let's see here. Where we go here? V'zehu, yeah. Okay, so just to sum up, because a lot of points here. Number one, the Biur Inyan is that Ein Arech Lecha, the Yesh in Elam Haza indicates on that infinite distance, like the Kalim. Oid does not, because it's too close to its source, so to speak, meaning it reflects its source. It's similar. It reveals its source. It's similar to its source. Therefore, it's Ayin Yesh, okay, and therefore it needs constant renewal. In Ayin Beis, you say it needs constant renewal, and therefore, point 3, therefore its entire existence, while it exists, is Kol Mitzvah Rak Ayin Eliki. It's only the Ayin Eliki that's energizing it. So just like we would say, a flying stone is not the power of the stone, it's the power of the one who threw it. In this case, you could say the very stone itself is like the flying is it doesn't have any substance of its own. So the fact that it exists is the divine power that gives it existence. Now, why the Rebbe Rashab doesn't mention Shayach Vamuna, I'm not sure. It seems to me like very much the idea, unless there's some reason what he's saying here is somewhat different than Shayach Vamuna, which I would have to research a bit more. Because he did mention Tafresh Chavtes from Micha Moicha, and he's not mentioning Shayach Vamuna. That is a little, to me, it's a question why. Because it seems so obvious. That is the theme. But the fact, however, is that in Chassidus, there are different points. Shayach Vamuna is not covered, doesn't cover every aspect of Yesh Mayin. It's one particular aspect. So I need to, as I said, research that further. Just wondering out loud. I mean, it could be that he's referring to Shayach Vamuna, he just chose not to mention it for whatever reason. But it could also be that maybe because there's a different emphasis he wants to make here than the one in Shayach Vamuna, which, as I said, needs more looking into. Okay. So that's the last point, that it's only Enshu Mitzvah. Okay. And without the divine energy, be'emes, in truth, there's no Mitzvah at all. And this is what it says in Medrash Rabbah. Ayn Oid. When it says Ayn Oid, there's nothing else but God. This is the pasuk that we've been learning earlier. Remember, V'yadaita yem v'shavesa levavecha ki avayu elikim v'shamayim imal v'aos mitachas Ayn Oid Pasha v'schana. So he says, the Medrash says on Ayn Oid, what does it say? Afila b'chalol shaleilam. Ayn Oid, nothing but him, even chalol shaleilam, even in the space. Chalol means like the chalol, the space of the world, like outer, where the world exists. Even there's God. Umavur b'makom achad, and elsewhere it's explained. And interesting, this elsewhere it happens to be discussed earlier on page 1347, almost 100 pages back, or more than 100 pages back. No, almost 100 pages back. Shazel b'chinas Reshimu. Halol Shaleilam is talking about the Reshimu, the trace of the divine that remains in the Cholol Makom Panei. Remember, the Cholol Makom Panei is the space that remained after the energy, the divine energy receded. There's the space. But we know it's not completely devoid of anything. There's a Reshimu there. So we learned earlier that the Reshimu, which is the root of the containers, that's Chalal Shaleilam. The Yidua the Reshimu, and it's known that the Reshimu, this trace, Hu B'chinas Keich HaGvul Shebe Ein Sof. That's the power of Gvul. Before the Tzimtzum, the power of Gvul was encompassed within the power of Bli Gvul. But after the Tzimtzum, and the light was concealed, the Eir HaBli Gvul, what remains is the Keich HaGvul, V'zeu Sheresh HaKelim. This is the root of the containers, B'chol B'chinas HaMetzias, and the root of all existence. The Reshimu, the Keich HaGvul, God's power to define, or God's power to limit and restrain, is the root of all structure and existence. Oir is God's power to reveal. And the Oir on its own would be Eir HaBli Gvul. Then there's also Eir HaGvul. But Keich HaGvul is the power to create structure, to create definition, which is rooted before the Tzimtzum. It manifests after the Tzimtzum in a concealed way in the Reshimu, and that's the root of the containers and the root of all of existence. Kenoida, as it's known. We discussed this earlier, actually, when we were speaking Mamata Lamaila, Ayn Oid, that the Tzimtzum itself, the concealment itself, is a divine power. You recall, Hela Ma'atzmi. V'yadua de Reshimche. But Eimer al Zeh Ayn Oid. Says the Medrash, Ayn Oid, afilu b'chalol shaleilam, which means Ayn Oid, even in the Reshimu, which is the root of Kelim and Metzias, the Bechinas HaMetzias dafke hu abitl de Ayn Oid. So he's bringing another proof to what he said Ein Arech before, that the Metzias, which is rooted in the Reshimu. What is the Medrash saying? Ayn Oid, even in Chalal Shaleilam. What does it mean, even? It's in the contrary, not just even. It's specifically in Chalal Shalelim, in the Reshimu, and the Metzias and Kalim and so on, is where you see the bittul of Ayn Oid, which is similar to what he said, Ayn Oid, and nothing else, nothing but the divine. Oid doesn't teach you that, because Oid can teach you that there is a source, but it doesn't tell you Ayn Oid, there's nothing but the source. The source has given off light. The Yesh tells you there's nothing but the source. Why? Because the Yesh indicates there has to be an Ayin. It indicates the Ayin has to constantly energize it. Indicates, therefore, that the Yesh doesn't have any existence without the Ayin, without the Koyach Halaki. So that's what the Medrash is saying. Ayn Oid afilu b'chalal shalelim. That Ayn Oid is seen in the Chalal Shalelim, this element, that nothing but the divine, because the whole existence is, all of existence is only due to divine energy within it. The Ba'oir, when it comes to Oir, Shudavuk Ba'etzem, Oir is attached to the source. It's not detached, it's attached in a very revealed way. And Shudavuk Ba'etzem, Shabitli B'chinas Kala Chashiv. There, the bitl, you don't call it Ayn Oid, you call it Kala Chashiv. Meaning it's nullified, as if it's nothing. It's like the light of the candle, shraga betira mayahan, light of a flame in the light of the sun. You don't say there's nothing but the sun. There's light, but the light is completely nullified because the Oid is davuk, is attached to the source, and therefore there's something commensurate, so to speak. So it's kala chashiv. How does it? That kala v'loy mamish, v'loy mamish. Kila means kamoy loy, chaf adimyan, kiloy. It's kila like as if it's nothing, but you can't say it's nothing at all because it does reflect the divine. And since the divine is something, so the light of the divine is something. But the Yesh doesn't have any of that. Behind sha'ir b'mitzias gili al kaponim, because the Oid is at least an expression of revelation. Rak shenirgish by mekeirei. One second, let me just read this again. Yeah, there is a Metzias Gili, and it feels at least Gili, but it feels Rak, but however it feels, its source. The light is always aware of its source, how God alone and nothing else. So the light already feels that, senses that. Remember the second expression is Ayn Arech L'cha ve'ein zu l'secha. U'kamashon is bar leil, as we learned earlier. So Ayn zu l'secha means there's no other like you, but it doesn't mean that there's no one infinitely distant like you. Aval b'mitzias hayesh. But Metzias Yesh, you don't say that. Habitlu b'chinas Ayn Oid, not just kila. There, the bitl is Ayn Oid, nothing else. Hainu shebe'emes ein b'mitzius klal, because in truth, existence, the Yesh, is not existence at all. Ki kol mitzius rak ayin eliki. Its entire existence has nothing but the ayin eliki that sustains it. Whereas the light has the fact that it's reflecting the divine. It's Maila, meaning its quality is what? That I am not me, I'm not an entity of my own, I'm a reflection of the divine. And therefore, it doesn't have that concept of complete nullification of itself. I know it's like a twist, and we'll talk about it more. So if that's the case, and then what do we see here? Don't we always say that the Oid is the element, is the entity that makes us feel the divine, and the Yesh doesn't make us feel the divine. So why are we saying this? So he says, Rak. It's when we think about the Yesh, we come to realize the Ein Arech of God. But the Yesh itself doesn't feel this. We feel ourselves like a Metzias, like an existence. But when you concentrate, you think about it, you realize that our Metzias is really the Ayin that's giving us substance. Well, Osid, in the future, year Bizgalus came by Yesh. In the future, Mashiach comes. This will be revealed in the Yesh. Like it says, all flesh together will see the divine. Pi Hashem Dibur, that the mouth of God is speaking. She'anira v'nigla, it will be seen and revealed. Eich shuhu advar Hashem, how the Metzias HaYesh is the word of God. Hainu ha'ayin alikiya mahava esei, the ayin aliki, the divine ayin, the other reality of the divine reality that brings it into being and creates it. V'zeu shalosh yeh hagufa lakus. And that's what it means. But in the future, the guf itself, the body, that today just feels itself, will be a lakus. So the fact is, it's a lakus now too, but we don't feel it. But it will reveal that dimension, and also it will be revealed. The be'emes kenu gam achshav. In truth, that's that way. The reality is also like that now. Rak she'achshav ein ze nirgish ba'yesh. But today, the yesh doesn't feel it. Sounds like he's repeating the previous line, but to emphasize the point. And it will be revealed, it will be seen and revealed that that is its existence. So the twist here is like this. Oid is revealed godliness. That's clear. If you see Oid, you see godliness revealed. Yesh, the godliness is concealed. However, the level of godliness that sustains the yesh indicates on a far higher level than the level of godliness that sustains the oir. Because the oir reveals, it doesn't tell us about the mysteries of the divine that are beyond oir, as we've learned and will learn. The yesh tells us about divine that's beyond oir. However, it's not revealed. So the oir is a revealer, and the yesh is far more quality. It's teaching us about a dimension of the divine that the Oid does not teach on its own. That's how we have to understand what he's saying here. So they're both needed, but that's why he's saying, Ein Arech L'cha, An Elam Hazeh, Ayn Oid, Chalol Shalelam. Whereas by Oid, you say, Ein Zulasecha, you say Kelah, like nothing, but you can't say that there's nothing but the divine, because the Oid is already an expression of the divine, and so its expression has a mila that it's expressing godliness. Its downside is it only expresses the godliness that's allowing itself to be expressed, not the divine that is beyond Ein Arech. That's the gist here. Now, just to go back for a moment, you go back to page where he talked about this. I've referred to this page a number of times. It's a very fundamental page to understand this well, about the Reshimu. I think it's on page, yeah, here we are. Page 1330. If you have a few minutes, read that. I'll do it maybe in the next class. 1330 is critical to really help understand what we're learning now. Like they go together. Not sure why the Rebbe Rashab is not referring to what he said earlier here. I'm not sure. Could be that he wrote this so much later. Not that, God forbid, he forgot, but it could be it wasn't like in the same flow. Because he refers to Commissioners Bar Le'il by Ein Zulasecha. But on page, did I say 1330? Let me just see if I'm right here. 1 second.
You said 1330. It says, the Reshimu Yesh Beis. Yesh by basing on him. Add some Nakudas that Reshimu.
Yeah, I see. I may have meant, let me just see if I meant that, or yeah, probably meant that. Yeah, that's probably it. Let me see. $13.30, but also, give me another minute. Let me just see something here. $13.30. Another page I wanted to refer to. Since I'm already giving, I want to just give you the right page. I think I meant a different page as well. Maybe much earlier. Okay, we'll stop here regardless. End of the paragraph. Any questions?
I had a question, but I don't want to go unless someone else has. If no one else has any questions.
Go for it. Nobody's asking. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this what we just read today.
Okay. What's that? Let me just say, I meant
actually
my mistake. I meant page 1270. 1270 is what I really meant. 1330 is also good, but 1270 is the main thing I really referring to. So our correction here.
Al Pisa Yuvan.
Yeah.
Okay. My question was, what we learned today is it's beautiful, and I personally could study it every day. I think we should all think about it every day, but I'm not sure it's novel and Ayin Beis. It seems like a theme we've talked about many times. I guess I'm trying to understand why he brings it here.
What's not novel? What are you referring to?
A number of things. The notion that everything but Metzias has its source in the Ayin. Everything is Yesh Ma'ayin. The Ayin and God vivifies everything.
Okay, so the answer to that is because he's coming to explain the Yichud. If you go to the top of the page when he says Va'inyan hu, he's coming to explain what is Yichud mean, both from the bottom up and from the top down. He's explaining Yichud.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Rabbi, on the review, could you just, where you start with Malchus and Zah, could you just give the other two before because I'm trying to write them down. The next two levels.
Chachma and Bina. If you look at pages 1436. He goes through each one of them.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop here. End of the paragraph, 1442. And it's not over yet. Got more to say on this whole Ayn Oid. And also keep in mind, I mentioned before, this is also partially like he did before with Hamayrik Be'echad. He's actually giving us the methodology of how to daven. What the kavanah should be when we say Hashem Echad and L'Yachid Kudshabrichu V'Shchinte. That's also part of this, of understanding the Yichud, also the kavanah that we say. That's going to go for another page till the end of page 1443. We're going to bring it all together. Yeah.
That's also helpful. Thank you.